SQL meets Hadoop. I'm Tony Bear. I'm principal analyst with Ovum. We're what the British call an ICT analyst firm. It's Information and Communications Technologies. It means basically IT and telco. We're based out of London. We're a global firm. And my area is data management and big data. And I have to say that when the folks at Hadoop Summit had originally approached me to do this session, I was certainly very flattered. I also had a bit of trepidation, which is that you get that first session that comes back right after lunch. And so it's the session where everybody falls asleep. I mean, I know you've all been, I'm guilty as charged. I was caught on Twitter about a month ago. But somehow I don't think that we're going to have that issue today, given the topic matter and given the panel that we have here. In that, when we were asked to make our predictions for 2013 in the big data space, and especially with Hadoop, now there are a lot of things that are happening with Hadoop. But when we look at what's happening in the commercial marketplace, our prediction was that SQL was going to be the area where you were going to see basically most of the vendors putting in the greatest, putting their stakes in the ground. And these folks here have not proven us wrong. So anyway, without much further ado, I'd like to introduce we're getting started a little bit late, so I'm going to make some very quick introductions on the panel, and then we'll fire through on the questions. So sitting will be right next to me is Anjul Bambri. You are Vice President for Big Data at IBM, and you're responsible for setting the vision and strategy for product development, for customer engagements and business partnerships, and you've had 25 years of experience, and I'm not going to go through the whole rest of it, because if I go through everything here, we'll take about a half hour. Next to her, we have Bob Page. He is Vice President of Products at Hortonworks. And previously, he was Vice President of the Analytics Platform and Delivery at eBay. So if you want to talk about somebody who knows the requirements of basically trying to submit queries onto some very large platforms, Bob certainly has that background. Next to Bob is Gavin Sherry, and he is Chief Strategist for a Pivotal Data Fabric. And Gavin leads the technology roadmap, architecture, and R&D for Pivotal's data processing technologies, which includes Hawk, which is basically Pivotal's SQL engine for Hadoop. And next to Gavin is Charles Zaluski, who is Vice President of Products at Cloudera. And previously, he held a number of positions in product management and product strategy over at SAP. He led the development of roughly about a half dozen products and follow-on releases. And finally, last but not least, we have Stefan Groschow. He is co-founder and CEO of Datameer. And Datameer was probably one of the first BI tools that was expressly designed for Hadoop. He was originally, in his past life, one of the original contributors to Nutch, which was the open source search engine project from which Hadoop sprang. As I said, I've really not done justice to your qualifications, but we only have about a half hour of time, so I hope you'll forgive me here. So anyway, we have a few questions here, and I think the obvious one to start off with is basically, what is your company's strategy on SQL and Hadoop? So we'll start off with Anjul.
Thanks, Tony. It's been pretty critical that to help the bulk of the SQL developers cross the chasm, it was very critical to bring SQL to Hadoop. So what we are doing is bringing a very rich SQL 2010 compliant, the richness of that to Hadoop, combining that with the performance, so bringing the MPP processing to the Hadoop framework. And obviously, the data that is being brought in Hadoop is of little value if you cannot do analytics on that. So really leveraging SQL as a way to get into analytics engine I would say, are the three main things that we are keeping in mind while bringing SQL to Hadoop.
Well, so at Hortonworks, we decided SQL on Hadoop was probably a bad idea. So SQL in Hadoop, however, is really powerful. And rather than have something that's a legacy or bolt-on, we would use what is currently the most popular SQL engine in Hadoop, has the most users, the most developers, the most UDFs, the most widely distributed SQL engine, which is Hive, and we'd make it better. So that's what we're focused on through an initiative that we call the Stinger Initiative. You heard a little bit about it earlier this morning. And it's a multi-phased approach, not just Hortonworks, but the whole community working in open to make sure that it becomes more SQL compliant and more performant, and that's our strategy.
Thanks, Tony. Like my colleagues at IBM and at Hortonworks, we really see the value of SQL within Hadoop as well. And while we were very interested in the developments that took place at Hortonworks around Hive, we know that customers really have a dire need today. And so we've produced a system called Hawk. It's actually a very mature SQL processing system that runs inside our Hadoop distribution. It's taken significant R&D effort from the Greenplum database, which is a mature MPP data processing platform, and brings it to the world of Hadoop. It really integrates with semi-structured and unstructured data, as well as sort of columnar and relational data as well. The important thing at Pivotal is that we've been able to harness more than 10 years of deep innovation in the area of parallel databases and bring it to what is a very exciting market in the world of Hadoop.
So at Cloudera, since the beginning of the company, there's always been demand for users that know SQL to apply their skills to Hadoop. For the longest time, we would route them to Hive, and we found that for batch processing, it did a great job. But for the BI users, we did a lot of integration with BI tools in Hive, but the abandonment rate of BI users was very high. And the reason was the latency was extremely high, and most people said, you know what, forget it, just copy a bunch of data out to a database. I'd sooner absorb the expense than deal with the experience they have. Thankfully, Google had this same problem, and they had this problem, I don't know, 7 or 8 years ago, and they built a system for this called Dremel, which leverages a lot of the classic MPP database techniques to get much lower latency and much higher efficiency performance. So our target for development was at least 1 order of magnitude better than what was possible with a MapReduce-based approach like Hive. We shipped this last year in beta. It's called Impala. Couple key things to note. It is completely open source. It's available under an Apache license. It has open Jira, GitHub, user list. You can use it as widely as you want with no obligation to us. And it is slightly different than a normal MPP database. It tries to preserve the idea of the flexibility that you get with Hadoop. So you can store your data in the original formats. It'll work with sequence file, text file, RC file, Parquet, Avro. It will use your existing metadata. If you've got your schema defined in the Hive metastore, it leverages all of that. Works with your existing security model. And also works with the existing cluster resources that you have. So we've done a lot of work to stitch it in with the rest of the Hadoop stack, and it's starting to open up access to Hadoop data to the BI user community.
SQL on Hadoop. Well, Datameer thinks that it's not senseful or nonsense. I happen to know I was there when we at Nudge decided not to go for MySQL, but build a sequential optimized system, right? So the way to think about the Hadoop file system is like your old tape drive. You guys remember that? If you try to find a song on the end of the tape? That's how the file system of Hadoop works. So if you want to do skips and queries and very fast access, and you have to go to the whole tape, and maybe even have to jump over a few network hubs to get there, it's not very fast. So I'm a big fan of MPP databases. If you need SQL, by the way, SQL is 50 years old. And you have structured data only. So there's a really mature market, very great MPP databases. Greenplum is one of them, Vertica, Teradata, Astrodata, Paracel. Do I miss something? Oracle, DB2. All of them are really great. But the reason we wrote Hadoop is to do something completely different. It's the late binding schema concept. It's kind of the 3D printing for data, right? We bring the raw material into data, into Hadoop, and then we can do views of this. If we put SQL on top of Hadoop, all that disappears. What we get is SQL in a sequential file system, what's, by the way, 100 to 1,000 times slower than other MPP databases. We have to pre-structure our data. In the 21st century, we still have to build schemas and ETL all the data in. So anyhow, so no, Datameer believes in NoSQL. I think that's a progress. We think that having no schema and schema on read concepts are a step forward. And if you need SQL, then there's really great technology out there that's already working. And based on B-tree data structures and random access, so building this on a sequential file system isn't optimal.
So what do the rest of you folks think about that? You all agree, right? Why don't you start with you, Charles?
Yeah, I respectfully disagree. I mean, first of all, it's true that HDFS is very scan intensive, but so are analytic databases. You know, it's not, most analytic databases do lots of scans and aggregates. So there's a reason why HDFS is really, really well wired to do this. I do believe there's a lot of advantages to schema on read. And you know, we actually designed Impala to support that kind of modality. By the way, we're not saying everyone has to use SQL to the complete exclusion of MapReduce or search or lots of other things. All those options should be available. The strength of Hadoop is going to be its flexibility and its openness to acquire different families of workloads. So I don't think we should say that it has to be all one way or all another way. And the 10 to 100x difference in performance, it's just not what our customers experience. I mean, even when they were doing batch Hive, no one was talking about 10 to 100x difference relative to their favorite MPP databases. It's a darn sight closer than that, and that's before advances like Impala. So I think it's well within reach.
I would agree with Charles that fundamentally Hadoop is a sort of toolkit or multi-tool. It's not a single tool that has to fix all problems. And when you see the kind of advantages of MPP database technology in 100x or in our case 1000x for Hive, you really see the use of having a new tool in the arsenal. The problem that I see really with making Hive faster is that every bit of making Hive faster inevitably chews away at the utility of MapReduce, which candidly concerns me because MapReduce is an amazing tool for interacting with unstructured data or less rigorously schemed data, and I wouldn't want to lose that at the expense of a little bit of performance, given that we have superior solutions.
Kevin, I'd love to introduce you to Yarn, as well as Tez, and the things that are going on in the Apache world to break away from the history of MapReduce as the only processing paradigm. You're not going to see Hive use MapReduce. You're going to see it use Tez on top of Yarn. And you're going to be able to see things like MapReduce, Reduce, and other paradigms that will approach the kind of MPP speeds that you're talking about. However,
when will that be
without having
again?
to preload data, it's happening today. Look at Hive 11. It's happening today. And let me go on record as saying I agree with Charles.
Gavin?
It's somewhat naive to say that you shouldn't do SQL on Hadoop. We have a huge investment in people, And to just say, you know what, forget about all those skills, because it's a different technology is naive.
Yeah, and I would say that I agree with that, right? We really undermine the skills issue a lot, right? While a lot of companies, at least in the Valley, are able to get people with skills who can, do NoSQL or MapReduce. There is a lot of investment that retailers, insurance companies, healthcare, that they have made in where the data is not just going to all move to Hadoop and NoSQL is going to be the way. So what Hadoop allows is that it's able to bring sort of like a polystructured store and that you can bring in all kinds of data in the enterprise now without worrying about what questions you're going to ask and without putting a structure to it, without putting a schema to it. But in a lot of workloads, there is some structure that this data has to reach. And then that has to be combined with what you already have in the enterprise, might be sitting in a warehouse. So having SQL as a way to access that data and combine it with the rest of the enterprise data is certainly a lot of applications are doing that.
Let me play devil's advocate, which is that, and I'll concede here, okay, Valley Think, which is what Merv was talking about earlier this morning. But by going through SQL, as Stefan was talking about, don't we run the risk of trying to take a look at new class of problem and new types of data with older methods that were meant for types of data that we had been used to? Are we missing out on something?
So, there are certainly new classes of applications that have been made possible because now you don't have to worry about processing and cleansing and putting a structure to this data to answer predetermined questions. It has certainly made possible that you can do ad hoc and interactive kind of analysis. But the use cases where, let's say, understanding your customer better or trying to get a 360-degree view of the data, that would still require that as you are looking at this unstructured or semi-structured data, there would be aspects that will be extracted and some structure will be put around it to really extend and enhance, say, even the customer profiles that were just based on what you had in the warehouse or in your CRM systems. So when data reaches that structure, I mean, the best way to query that is the structured query language.
Okay.
I disagree with the premise of the question. I think you wouldn't have all these folks here working on SQL and SQL-like interfaces into data if there wasn't a demand for it. There's an enormous demand for skills transfer. Now, are you going to want to do image analysis in SQL? Probably not. But if that's the choice you want to make, I say go for it. Right? And then after you sort of hit your head enough times and you see this is the wrong approach, then maybe you try something different. But who's to stop anybody from doing that?
Exactly. It's the great appeal, as I mentioned before, of Hadoop, of the toolkit, where you can choose the appropriate tool for the problem. And SQL is a fantastic tool. In fact, it's almost certainly the best language we have to date for asking sophisticated questions of data. This was the reason why we tried extremely hard with Hawk to bring a very recent version of the SQL standard to bear upon Hadoop and be able to ask not just basic questions like, how much of this data happens to reside in that table, but questions around time series and questions around roll-ups and moving averages and things of this sort.
Yeah, I mean, I just want people to work in the modality that they like, right? I mean, great. If you're a SQL person, how would you like some SAS procs, right? We've done a lot of work with SAS to bring that framework to the platform. What if you're a doctor? What if you don't know anything about SQL? How about a search interface, right? We're offering faceted search, too. I mean, we want to let people work in the modality that makes them most productive. And the key thing, though, is that there needs to be a certain level of harmonization so that different people can do these things, but you don't build little islands of data that just happen to share one cluster, right? So you need to all be able to work off the same metadata. We're very big believers in an open metadata model. You all have to be able to work off the same underlying file formats. We're very big believers in openness there, because you need to be able to hop between these different modalities, because the data scientist is going to create some analysis for some fancy model, and when it's done, the SQL user is going to want to query that result. So you need to be able to move between these multiple different modalities in a facile way, and that's where a lot of the engineering work goes, especially for something like Impala. We're not trying to win a drag race, although I got to start tweeting about some order of magnitude faster than something because it's just too tempting. 10,000 times faster isn't taken yet. We're
working on it, though.
Well, too late. I said it first. So
yeah, but 10,000 times faster than what?
Yeah, we're not trying to run a drag race. What we are trying to do is have the most integrative experience possible. The analogy that I beat to death is that if you all have a smartphone right now, right, that smartphone has a camera in it, and that camera is nowhere near as good as the Nikon or the Pentax 35mm with all the fancy lenses. But most of you have more of your photos today in your smartphone than you do in your Nikon, because it's convenient. If it's convenient and it's integrated with other frameworks, you will adopt it, even if it's not, even if it doesn't win the drag race record for a particular query speed.
Mm-hmm. The power of the drag race, though, just to jump in here, is when we first demoed Hawk to a very large retail customer, they took a workload that took an entire month to run, like the whole set of reports that they were generating from all their retail data, and were able to run it in 1 hour. I mean, at that point, productivity within the company is just improved enormously. That really is the power of this MPP-style database technology within a Hadoop context.
Well, I'm all agreeing with give people the tools they want to choose, right? And most likely, people always go to the thing they already know and very comfortable with. But so I do this since 10 years, right? And what we really need to understand is that Hadoop fundamentally was architected in a different way. There's a lot of noise, and we, of course, as vendors, all want to get as much market share as possible. So, of course, we will put the chocolate on top of all this. But here's where I see people fail, and especially around investment in people, right? People putting Hadoop in organizations and say, you know what, Hadoop seems cool, open source, this will be so much IT savings if I replace my traditional enterprise data warehouse. They mess around for a year, and then they realize, wow, there are very limited integration tools. Oh, there's a lot of BI tools that have a Hadoop sticker, but actually they're all expecting milliseconds or second query response time. No one, not a single tool is bringing this. So we see this again and again where companies coming in and say, oh, Hadoop now has SQL, so I can replace my enterprise data warehouse. But this is really mature technology, right? And what we're working on is, you guys think it goes in the right direction, but it's not, right? And we see companies failing again and again. And you know where they're failing? By, again, doing this, what we do since 40 years, where we had limited storage and compute, where we spend millions in engineering hours, pre-optimizing our schema, ETLing our data in, and then presenting it to business users, and they say, well, actually, I want to have a different join. Schema migration is the biggest problems in organizations. And here's where Hadoop has an opportunity, right? The opportunity is really that new schema on read version, the process. And just putting something, because we're very comfortable since 40 years, on something that was fundamentally built different. I mean, I encourage everybody to go back to the Nudge mailing list. It's all open on the Apache website, and read those never-ending discussions where we went to sequential, MapReduce, and yes, with Yarn we will get in memory, and it's all awesome. But you know what? We already have it. So we're backporting our opportunity to save significant amount of effort in our data platform, pre-optimizing data, creating schemas, all that kind of stuff, what we did the last 40 years. We're backporting Hadoop from NoSQL, what was an innovation, to NoSQL. And yes, SQL has its place, and it will be there, and it's great for operational system, where you can actually do random access right in there, read out there. But for analytics, it's very limited. We can't do network analytics, we can't do unstructured data, all the good stuff we talked about, right? So I think what we need to be honest to the market is that right now we're trying to get market share, and putting the chocolate crusting on top of the cake looks really good for a lot of people because they already know what chocolate is. But we intentionally built Hadoop for a different approach. And yeah, it's uncomfortable to think about the new stuff. But where today we're wasting time is this pre-optimization of data, the schemas, and this is where our business users just go into the cloud, where we render the IT useless, or basically being this in between, the barrier between innovation and what we can do. I mean, I saw it hundreds of times in organization. Business comes in with a new idea every 2 weeks, and IT says, well, it takes 18 months to change the schema.
Okay. I'm going to shift gears for a moment and ask more of a market-based question, because basically if you folks are putting this technology out or putting an alternative version, alternative approach out, ultimately they're going to have to make decisions as to what to buy and what to expect in terms of what's standard, what isn't standard. Now, I'm not going to ask about standards versus proprietary, because that's kind of, it's a little too black and white. But I want to really take it more from a standpoint of what is the market going to be like for the customer. And I want to give the prior example of SQL. SQL was an ANSI standard, and you basically have a large market, a large commercial ecosystem of SQL databases. Yet each of those databases implements SQL a little differently, and in turn it leads to differences that get to be structural. So the end result is that even though, let's say, you may have SQL Server, DB2, Oracle, the skills base to tackle it is different. It's essentially a platform decision. The question I have is SQL on Hadoop or SQL in Hadoop, however you want to phrase it, is this going to be the same type of choice that customers are going to face? Well, Stefan, you want to start off?
There's a big risk to lock into a vendor, right? I mean, that's the whole movement right now. That's the whole idea. If you look into the market, that's why everybody is working on his own thing. And yes, we make it open source. That's great. But there's a risk, right? I mean, the most stable APIs is MapReduce, is HDFS, and I would love to see Yarn being production ready, because this will be awesome. I totally agree with you, Bob, in building stuff on top of that. But there's a very big risk, right? So, I mean, who knows where all this company is going in a year from now. It's a super hot market. We will see merger and acquisitions for sure, or we will see companies not making it. And if you want to build a platform today, you have to build it for the next 10 years. I mean, that's the reality. We still have mainframe in our companies, not in ours, but maybe in yours. So it depends if you work in financial services, maybe. And there's a risk, right? So we need to be aware of that. And I would welcome all vendors to get together on a table and start talking about standards and so on. And we tried it a little bit. We failed because it was a little bit too early. But if you look in the history, all platforms that got very successful at some point got together and said, okay, let's define a standard. And everybody implements the standard, SQL, G2E, all that good stuff. And then, everybody is putting his own little secret sauce to it. But if I have a BI tool that runs on top of Hadoop somehow, I want to make sure it runs on version A of Hadoop, version B, version C, version D. And right now, what happens is very, very dangerous. What happens is like an Android kind of thing where everyone here right now has its own little kind of thing, and it's not as compatible as it should be. Very dangerous.
I mean, I'm a big believer in customers having portability and not feeling locked in. With respect, I mean, I've seen your product. It looks very structured in that product. The difference is the metadata is in your product. So I don't really know. You're debating whether you put the structuring in an open system or in your system. But a customer is tethered to an approach. In our case, we believe HDFS. I mean, HDFS is a widely adopted standard. Impala runs on HDFS. HBase is a widely adopted standard. Impala runs on HBase. Hive Metastore for schema, widely adopted standard. Impala leverages existing Hive Metastore. File formats, we leverage all the file formats you already use. So are you going to have complete frictionless portability? No, I think that's probably a little aggressive. I don't think there's any market. I mean, 2 different Linux distros. There's no 2 different J2EE engines. There's nothing so much as frictionless portability. But we have taken a lot of pains to try to reinforce existing standards as opposed to pull them at the fringes. So that's something we take very seriously. Even SQL dialect, when we shipped Impala, we made sure that we supported HiveQL, and now we're expanding the support for ANSI SQL. So we don't have any interest in trying to differentiate based on funky SQL extensions. We have an interest in creating a really compelling BI experience and a really compelling interactive SQL experience for the family of users that like that sort of thing. And so when we add SQL functionality, we're just spackling in the gaps that have been there over time so that we can make a better end user experience.
This is the case with Hawk as well. Hawk is SQL 2003 compliant. It also relies upon the very stable HDFS APIs, the file formats inside of HBase, inside of Hive, and the other common Hadoop formats as well. So it was very important to us when we built Hawk that people were able to mix and match to interact with Hawk or with the rest of their Hadoop deployment in the way that they chose. The important thing is that with respect to SQL is an incredibly well thought out language. Whilst there's been some knocking about its age, it's not 50 years old, it's 42 years old. The reason why it's had such incredible longevity is that the language is very, very pure and extremely expressive and has been stable for such a long time. As I mentioned before, it really is the best language we have to date. I'd love to find an even better one, but the best language we have to date for asking sophisticated questions of SQL. In the 13 years, Greenplum and now Pivotal worked on SQL, and in my 5 years before that, where I worked on the PostgreSQL project, I've come to know SQL incredibly well and really been impressed by and humbled, quite frankly, by what has been given to us by the SQL Standards Committee. So I wouldn't recommend compromising that SQL standard really in any way.
Yeah, I hope IBM jumps in and says, 1966, you got the patent for SQL right here, 10 kilometers south, right?
So I think going back to the point that there is also already an ANSI SQL standard, which has been developed over so many years, taking into account what are the requirements for a language like SQL, keeping the applications, the use cases in mind. So for the parts that have already been developed and have been standardized, it makes sense to carry them forward. So at least that's our approach, right? That we've released capabilities called Big SQL, which is ANSI 2010 compliant. But there are certain constructs for which there are no standards yet, and those will have to be developed. And that's where I think all of us need to collaborate so that we do it by standardizing on those things. So it's not complete by any means, but it's come a long way, and there is no reason to throw it away. At least so far, when we are seeing deployments of where people are, bringing in Hadoop and actually deploying applications, very much the needs that they have are being met by what ANSI SQL has to offer.
Bob, you get the last word.
No, I agree. I think SQL's been very expressive, and there's no reason to fundamentally screw around with it. It is an ANSI standard, but there are many versions of the ANSI standard, and that's because the expressiveness continues to move forward. And we don't know what SQL managing the sort of classic unstructured data. I know unstructured is a bad word, but we don't know what it's going to mean to query video files. But I suspect SQL will be extended to do that at some point. And will we all adopt it immediately? Maybe, maybe not, don't know. But I can tell you with an enormous developer base, you're going to have a lot of different approaches that are going to come towards this. I agree that there's a long-term play. You're talking about a 10-year bet, potentially, and you're going to be building systems for all your developers and your analysts to use. It's important to sort of bet right, if you will, right? Okay. And so you look at, do I want to do it a proprietary way? Do I want to do it an extensible way? Do I want to do it in a way in which it's truly open, with a big community? There's all these different factors that you got to look at.
One just brief thing I want to add is, one of the things I love about this industry as a product guy is that if you're in the open source game, like, you can download this stuff and try for yourself. There's been a lot of discussion on maturity and 1000x claims and all of this. The beauty is, like, you put up your software, you make it available for anybody to use on their workload, their data set, and they can figure out for themselves whether or not the queries fall apart or the BI experience is bad or whether Hawk is truly 1000x faster. So I really encourage you, like the acid test, go see if you can, go to websites, see if you can find something to download and try it. That's the best thing about open source. You don't need to read marketing literature to figure out what works. You can actually just try the software. So I encourage you all to do that.
Try it, you'll like it. Yep. Anyway, our time's gone really fast, and I think we feel, and I trust you probably all agree, we've really only scratched the surface. I really, at this point, would like to thank our panelists, Anshul, Bob, Gavin, Charles, Stefan. I'd like to thank you all for joining us this afternoon again. Said we didn't have very much doubt in terms of whether this session would keep people awake. I know it kept me awake, and that's an accomplishment. Anyway, thank you very much.
Thank you.